Hello, young scholars. I am your faithful teacher, Mr. Simpson, and today I'm going to teach you a new word, and that word is ethnocentrism. Another way we can use this word is to say ethnocentric. They mean the same thing, they're just different contexts. So we're going to look at some of those examples. One way to understand the word is to break it down into pieces. Ethno is our first part, and that tends to mean your culture. Centrism means centered or focused on. So another word that you might be familiar with that's very common is in Spanish you would say egocéntrico. In English you would say egocentric. Ego means yourself and centric means centered or focused on. So very similar to ethno, but in place of ethno we have egocentric. All right. Another word we have in English like egocentric that's even more clear is our word self-centered. It means the same thing as egocentric, but instead of saying ego, we say self-centered. Here's an example. Hey, Jason, we all want to go to the movies. This is a group of friends. And then Jason, who's just one person, tells to the three people, yeah, but it's my car, and I say we're going bowling. So he's self-centered because he's only caring about what he wants to do, and he does not think about what the majority wants to do. So if we take this example and look at our word ethnocentric, we can probably understand it better. Ethno, as I told you, means culture. Centric means centered. So a way we could think about this word is to say that you're culture-centered. Like you only see the world through the eyes of your own culture. You don't try to see other people's perspective. So our definition will be, you judge other people's culture based on the values of your own culture. Now that can be a very dangerous thing. Let's look at some examples. Example 1. A Colombian boy sees the clothes of a Japanese boy and thinks, those are ugly. So in this context, the Colombian boy is judging Japanese culture based on his own values. Of course, Japanese people don't think that their clothes are ugly, right? Example 2. A Japanese boy hears Colombian music and thinks, that sounds terrible. Again, the Japanese boy is judging Colombian culture based on his own values. Of course, Colombian music does not sound bad to Colombian people. A third example. A girl from the city thinks her cousin from the country is El Campo, acts funny. So a girl from the city thinks her cousin from the country acts funny. Also, the girl from the country thinks her cousin from Medellin acts funny. So in this case, the girl from the countryside looks at her cousin in the city and doesn't understand her culture and says, oh, well, she's weird. And the reverse example as well, the girl from the city sees the culture of her cousin who grew up in the country and thinks that that girl is also weird. So they're both judging each other based on different values. So what questions should we ask ourselves about the term ethnocentric? Pause the video for a second and try to write down an idea. And then when you finish, hit play and I'll show you the one that I came up with. So the question that I came up with was, why do we need to know this term? Why does it matter? So do you have any ideas for these two questions? Do you have any examples? Again, pause the video and see if you can come up with a couple of solutions to these questions. Well, the first thing is, it matters because we should treat others as we wish to be treated. If you don't like being judged, you shouldn't judge other people. So think about the Japanese boy who was saying that Colombian music sounds bad. If you think that that's foolish for him to say that and that's just his opinion, then why would you say the similar things about his culture, right? So it's a way for us to open our mind and look at the world in a more balanced way. Another reason why it matters is because ethnocentrism blinds you to the good things of other people's culture and you miss out on those benefits. So you judge another culture so negatively that you don't realize that there's actually good things that you could get from them, and it closes you off to the world. It gives you a more narrow worldview, which is something that we hope to avoid. Another thing, it matters because not being ethnocentric makes you a more loving person, and that makes the world a better place. So if you can learn to open your mind and accept people and look at their culture and try to understand it from their perspective, you can understand them. And of course, that type of thinking will actually create more sustainable societies and it'll make the world a better place to live in. So some examples in history. Egypt versus Kush. So Egypt was the powerful kingdom and Kush was another kingdom in the south. And when we see Egypt writing history today about Kush 2,000 years ago, we see that they saw Kush as kind of backwards people, kind of like montañeros, which we know that's not true, but when we read Egyptian history, that's what they say about them. So we can tell that the Egyptians were judging the Cushites based on their own Egyptian culture. Another example of ethnocentrism in history, every war ever. Ethnocentrism makes you focus on the things that make you different from other people, and it makes you focus on the things that you don't like about them. So that's why we say anytime you're fighting a war, you're obviously being ethnocentric. Think about the Germans versus the other powers in World War II. Of course, the Germans did not accept Jewish culture, and they thought the Jewish were bad people. They could have easily looked at the good things in Jewish culture, but instead they looked at the negative things, right? Looking at the differences. And again, you could pretty much say every war ever is an example of ethnocentrism. Where I'm from, black and white people 50 years ago, there was lots of racism. White people thought that their culture was superior, and they thought that black culture was not. And of course, this is all based on ethnocentrism, trying to make other people have our culture or judging them based on our culture, which is not fair. An example from Colombia would be like the conquistadores versus the indígenas. So if you can imagine when the Spanish, who were your ancestors, came to Colombia, they judged very harshly the Indians because they saw them as backwards people. They didn't choose to see the things that the Indians had that were good. They only saw the bad things. And of course, they weren't Christians. They weren't Catholics. So they began to kill the Indians and take their land from them. And so again, as you can see, ethnocentrism causes violence because it makes us look at what makes us different as opposed to the things that make us similar. But this doesn't happen anymore, right? Well, what about Wayuu? Why is it that the Wayuu have such a water crisis in Colombia? Yes, there's a sequía, but the sequía affects many parts of the country. Why do they specifically have greater problems? If we look at some of the corruption that's happened in that area of the country, you could hypothesize that maybe we don't see their culture as important. They're backwards. They live like Indians lived 1,000 years ago. If they don't want to live like that, they should come live in the city, right? So we're judging their culture and trying to make them fit into our culture. So some final thoughts for you. Most of us are naturally ethnocentric because we grow up in one culture, that being our culture. So what is your culture? Like what actually makes you Colombian, or what makes you Paisa, or what makes you whatever you are? Now ask yourself, how ethnocentric is your worldview? What group of people do you judge or perceive negatively? Because obviously you understand that group of people probably don't see their own selves as negative. You don't like people from the US or Europe looking at Colombia and saying, oh, they're full of traquetos and cocaine. You think that's unfair. So then why would you do that to another culture? We have to wake up and learn to see through a more balanced perspective. Here's one last task, and I'll ask you about this in class. So try to think about this in the next day or so. How ethnocentric is your news? Now, you're young and you may not watch news, but what is news to me? News means TV, social media like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, advertisements that you see on commercials, things like that. These are all the things that shape your worldview. So if they're shaping your worldview, ask yourself, how ethnocentric are they? Is it a balanced perspective, or does it show other cultures in negative ways? That's only a question that you can answer, but start to pay attention. See you in class.